Good evening, everyone. I am going to go ahead and call this meeting to order. Thank you to those attending in person tonight and those staying engaged by watching our recording at a later time. The public is reminded that if they wish to speak during community comment, they will need to fill out a speaker form located in the lobby on the table and turn it in to Board Secretary Kim Coven, seated at the end on my left. Community comment will take place during the designated portion of our agenda. And before we dive into tonight's agenda, I want to take a moment to introduce those seated at the table with me. To my right, we have Superintendent Degner, Directors Pilcher Hyatt, Eastham, Vice President Williams. To my left, we have Directors Abraham, Clausen, Finch, and Board Secretary Coven. With that, we will dive into tonight's agenda. And it doesn't look like I have any community comments, so I will move to seeking approval of tonight's agenda.
I move we approve the agenda.
Second.
Board Secretary Coven, we're ready to vote.
Online voting is open. All votes have been cast and the motion carries with all directors voting in favor.
Thank you. Before I check to see if there's any items directors would like to pull from consent agenda, wanted to double check if there was any questions or concerns raised by other directors who reviewed the bills for this cycle. Okay. Are there any items directors would like to pull from consent agenda? Hearing none, I would entertain a motion for approval of tonight's agenda.
I move that we approve tonight's consent agenda.
Second.
Thank you. Board Secretary Coven, we're ready to vote.
Online voting is open. All votes have been cast and the motion carries with all directors voting in favor.
Thank you. That takes us right into the equity update, which is equitable grading practices. Superintendent Degner, who should we turn that over to?
Yeah, but turn it over to Mr. Potacek here, and we have Mr. Colbert, or Dr. Colbert from Liberty High School with us this evening. Carmen is also going to help out. And Brady, are you participating in this one at all? No. He'll be here to answer questions, yeah. We might just bring him up just because we haven't heard from him in a while. So, yeah. But we have a team of folks here to talk to you a little bit about this one tonight and some of the work we've been doing the last few years around this.
Great.
All right, thank you, Superintendent Degner. I'm honored, as Matt had mentioned, to be here with both Carmen and with Justin. We're going to speak to two different aspects of the presentation here this evening. Again, as he had mentioned, this isn't work that just began this year. This is work that has continued over the course of the last 2 years that began with Nick when he was in this role previously. Just want to go over the overview of what we intend to cover here tonight. Again, this is a multi-year project that we've been working on. So looking at the grading for equity work that many of our staff members, both teachers at the secondary level, as well as administrators are participating in, as well as our alignment with our high reliability schools. So where we've been, then where we are currently. And Carmen's going to speak to our curriculum work, establishing our priority standards and proficiency scales, and then ultimately where we're going. And what you'd seen on the last slide is our draft of what we intend to roll out to all of our secondary schools next year. So I am always reminded of the graphic that Superintendent Degner provided at the beginning of the year to our staff, and I think also to you guys, that arrows that point everywhere are not good for anybody, but arrows that are always aligned in the same direction really do help provide continuity and as well as a purpose of what we're doing. So as we go through the work here tonight, our equitable grading practices really do align with our strategic plan, looking specifically at multiple areas with our focus. So school culture, looking at student learning, as well as our system and resources. And as we go through our different approaches here this evening, we're really looking at high reliability schools levels 1, 2, and 3 with our work. So last year and this year, we had a cohort of teachers. Some remained the same over the course of 2 years. Some were new this year, but we had started with a little about 40 and then ended with about 36 different teachers that were enrolled with the Crescendo group. So all of our secondary staff members participated in our optional TQ day. We had Courtney Fenner from the Crescendo Group, and they're a group out of California who partners with different districts across the United States, looking at how they can refine their grading practices. And she gave a great keynote, kind of a background of the reason why, the research why we should look into different grading practices within our school system. And then really that piloted and kind of springboarded the work of our different buildings. And again, this is a 2-year approach. I'm really proud of the work that our teachers have done over the course of the last 2 years, and I'm really proud of the work that our administrating team have done, especially this spring, as we really look to provide consistency across all of our buildings with how we are approaching instruction and assessment and grading with all of our students. So as you can see, 36 different teachers were enrolled. You see the different stats that are there, along with those 36 teachers as far as how impactful they felt the work was within their practice. And in just a little bit, you're going to see that within those 36 different teachers, some partnered up with other teachers in their buildings, and some worked individually, all in different research practices and research cycles. They had different coaching cycles that they participated in, both virtual and in person, looking specifically at their research practice. And it was very interesting, as you're going to see in just a little bit, what they were researching, a lot of it pairs with what our grading policies look like. So this, while it involved only 40 different teachers across our secondary buildings, really the work of this 40 teachers helps springboard where we're at with our different grading practices. So they took what they learned and took it back to their staff, both to their administrative team as well as their building leadership teams through their ILT. So here you see a different example of multiple types of research cycles that they participated in. As I said, there are at least 4 throughout the year that they were able to participate in, and you see a number of different things, and some of these are multiple staff members across multiple buildings participated in these, but what they wanted to do was tackle something that they think would make them better instructors within their classroom and ultimately make better experiences for their students. And they're able to then take that research back to their large cohort with the 40 and then also work with their administrative team. So I focused a lot on the 40 teachers that participated in that cohort, but we also had at least one administrator from each of our secondary buildings that participated in virtual sessions with other district leaders and building leaders across the United States that were able to share different types of things that they're experiencing when they're in their district. And what I'm very happy to at least promote here tonight is the fact that I felt that the work our district was embarking on, we weren't experiencing some of the same hurdles or roadblocks that these other districts were doing, where they had really what I felt our teachers had the grace to go. What do you think is going to be best for your kids in your building? What do you want to do? And then get after it and then take it back to see how we can embed that on a larger scale outside of just your classroom, into your building, and into a larger system like all of our secondary buildings. So you see, again, the examples of those research cycles that our teachers participated in. And I'm going to turn it over here now, I can speak big system, and Justin's going to talk to his experience with his staff at Liberty.
All right, thanks, Lucas. Thanks for having me this evening. So just one thing that I'll echo that Lucas touched on there too, in terms of where we're at in the process and not having those barriers. One thing I want to emphasize with this group too is how much further along we were than a lot of the other districts and a lot of the other buildings that we worked with in this work over the last year. So that felt really good to know and be able to share our experiences and then hear where other people were and just how much further we were in the work. So that was encouraging for us. So what I'm going to start with today is just kind of provide a brief timeline of what it's looked like for us at the building level. So of course we opened in 2017 and we didn't have a whole lot of consistency, and I think that was similar with a lot of buildings throughout the district in terms of what the grading practices were. And then at the time, the building leadership team going into that second year decided, hey, let's dabble a little bit and provide our staff with some more consistency that will hopefully flow down and benefit our students too. So we started initially by having a late work policy and a reassessment policy, and that's where we started. And then, of course, we all know spring of 2020, COVID hit, and that required us to make some drastic changes to our grading. And I think that's probably what pushed our staff further along in understanding the need for equitable grading practices, probably more so than anything else we had done prior. And thanks to that springboard, we jumped into it that following year, and we developed our first grading policy. All my years teaching, I'd never worked in a building that had a grading policy. It was one of those things that most teachers graded their students the way that they were graded when they were a student themselves. It's an area where teachers did have a lot of autonomy, and I think teachers appreciated that, but at the same time, it provided an inconsistent experience for a lot of our students. So we worked with our ILT, so our instructional leadership team over the summer. We developed a comprehensive grading policy, and we rolled it out with our staff at the beginning of the 2021-2022 school year. And I'm gonna show you that actually a little bit on the next slide. But again, it was just kind of taking those baby steps. And then we implemented that, had experienced that first year with it. And then what we did is we met again that following summer, had another ILT retreat, and took more baby steps forward, and some of the non-negotiable stuff that we had, we added to that list, okay? And along that way too is we were providing whole staff PD to our building. We engaged in a book study, Joe Feldman's book, Equitable Grading Practices. We offered that to our teachers to be able to read and have discussions on throughout PD throughout the school year. And then we, again, came back together and moved that PD, or moved that, that grading practices policy, or the grading policy forward, and felt really good about it. And then it worked really well with our district level then too, is when we get into the work, and we had more learning opportunities for our staff. We had more opportunities for people to grow their understanding of the why behind it, which created the greater buy-in for our staff too, to be able to implement those in the classroom. All right, so I'm not going to focus too much on the problem. I think we understand kind of why we were moving away from our traditional grading practices, but that's kind of the 4 areas that we identified in terms of the reason behind. And then one thing with the equitable grading practices is, in order for grading practices to be equitable, they have to be accurate, fair, bias resistant, and motivational. And we were able to get people to understand the accuracy part. We were able to get people to understand the bias resistant piece. But where we probably saw the most hesitation was, are they truly motivating? So that's where we really focused our attention and dug deep into this past year. But before I get into some survey results that we did with our student, I want to highlight just those grading policies that we put in place. And I know at Weston City, they did a lot of similar work in that we were in constant communication and working and understanding on terms of where people were. And actually, yep, it's this one. You had them in the right order. Okay, so here's our first version. And I think the first thing that I want to point out, obviously there's lots here, but just notice that we had 3 categories listed in those universal expectations, and that was that first baby step. We knew that our staff was there from an understanding standpoint. We know that our staff was there from an implementation standpoint, so we felt good rolling that out at that level. And then if you flash forward to that next year, you can see that list of universal expectations grew, it doubled. Okay, and it was going back to that point, all the PD we did, the book study that we did, the professional development that was provided at the district level and then the building level. We just felt like we could move in that direction with our staff. So that was the second rendition, and this is very similar to what we had in place in subsequent years, including this previous year. And we're not content with it. We're continuing to improve it. We actually just met with our ILT again for our summer retreat 2 weeks ago now. And there's 2 specific things that stood out in the data, especially from our survey when we asked the students for their feelings regarding the motivational level for the different grading practices, and we're going to make tweaks to that. And of course, that fits into our HRS work too, because that's something that we're constantly looking at and evaluating everything that we're doing. And we're no longer just waiting until the end of the year, but if it's a move that we feel like we can make during the year, we're making those constant tweaks so that students can have an immediate impact, hopefully an immediate positive impact from those changes.
Hey, Justin, one thing that maybe I would like you to go back to is that statement of problem, because I think sometimes those of us in it, we take it for granted, but maybe just spending some time on what is the problem we see with traditional grading practice and why is there a need for a change?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first piece there is the outdated grading practices. We know that education has changed tremendously over the last 100 years. What's interesting though is even though we've made all these changes, right, and I just think in the last 5 or 10 years going from your physical textbooks to now most students engaging in a textbook electronically on their Chromebook. seating configurations, right? If you think you go into a traditional classroom and they're kind of lined up in nice little neat rows, now you walk into a high school classroom and it's more typical that they're in pods and that there's a lot more design collaboration spaces within that classroom. Surprisingly, even though all those changes have occurred, grading hasn't changed. You know, that traditional 100-point grading scale, you know, the ABCDF, it's just the way that we've always done it for the past 100 years, really since the Industrial Revolution. So that's something that really stood out to us, is why has everything else changed, but the way we grade students or assess students hasn't changed. So one thing that they also identified is that reward privileged students. A great example of this is think about homework. Okay, if you have a student who comes from a privileged family, the privileged household, they most likely have a designated spot at home where they can complete that homework, right? They maybe have a desk within their own bedroom that they have just by themselves. Maybe their parents are available, they're not working a late shift, so they're able to provide that support to the student while they complete that homework. Or maybe they even have access to a private tutor, and that tutor is helping them through that homework. On the flip side, if you have a student from an underprivileged household, maybe it's a single parent household, they go home to a smaller home, and maybe the spot that they're supposed to do their homework also doubles as the kitchen table, right? And that's where they're having their meals, and maybe it's not available because they're making meals at that time. And instead of coming home and having the support of that parent who's not working to help them with homework, maybe they not only don't have that support, but they're also caring for their younger siblings, right? Because their parents work in that third shift. So that's kind of what it's hitting at with that second and that third bullet. And then the other one too is, especially Joe Feldman, he's done a lot of research in this area, and he's found that actually when students are earning an F or even a really low grade, maybe a C or a D, and if that's not meeting their standards, then it actually demotivates them and they withdraw from that class and they're not willing to engage in the new learning. So even if it's that first assignment, right, we know that learning, a lot of times it's progressive and you're building on those skills as you go through. But if they earn an F on that first assignment, they're checking out right from the get-go. So that's kind of what I was getting at with that statement of the problem in terms of why we're doing this work.
Yeah, thanks for going back to that. I always think about it too and I had a conversation with one of you guys today about this, that really what's a measure of learning, right? And I think, you know, those of you that have been closer to it know that, you know, completing a worksheet and doing a compliance-based thing that you turn around and get points for, and we call it point chasing, right? That you're just playing the game about trying to accumulate points, but have you really learned anything? It is a true assessment of learning. So I think it's a little bit bigger and deeper, that it's really about trying to keep the focus on a culture of learning rather than a culture of compliance, that we've completed this activity and now you're rewarded for it with the grade. But we really don't know if you've learned it, right? That, you know, we also, and I know they're going to talk about assessment some and, you know, about the bad test taker, right? Well, you know, how do we actually have a reflection of what you've learned or what you have not learned or what skills you've mastered or not mastered? So thanks for spending some time going back to that, because I think that about why we got here is a really important step before we start to solve the problem.
Yep, absolutely. All right.
Matt, if I could ask before we leave this, so is it possible to suggest that districts can devise assessments that measured learning better than the state and national assessment modalities do?
Might need a different meeting for that one, Charlie, about the assessment design. But I think really, you know, I think what the team will connect to here is how it starts to change the instruction, right? And I think that's the powerful part, is not just, you know, outdated grading practices, but also evolving in our instructional techniques and knowing that, you know, we can improve instructionally and we can continue to look for different ways to reach our students that do become a better barometer for what they're learning. And then our job is to, yes, create some assessments that measure that learning, but you know, there'd be a whole host of conversations probably around integrity around assessments, assessment design. I mean, you know, companies spend a tremendous amount of resources to provide those things. I mean, we obviously don't have those tools at our disposal, but I do think our staff is probably incredibly adept at being able to design assessments that do measure students' learning. And then how are we doing that across the system? I think that's what some of the team will start to talk about here too today.
Thank you.
All right, so the kind of the last piece I want to talk about is that reflection piece, right? We're implementing these grading practices, and we're not just going to implement them and leave it as and say, hey, we're the experts. This is what they say is best practice. We're just going to move on from it. But we found with our connection with our HRS work is we need to constantly review what we're doing. We need to constantly seek feedback for what we're doing. And it can't just be with staff. It can't just be with students. It's got to be with all the stakeholders. So what we decided to do at Liberty in January of this last year was to do a student survey. Again, we felt like we were there with the bias resistant and the accuracy piece, but we weren't sure as the grading practices that we were implementing, whether or not they were actually motivating to our students, right? Joe Feldman's telling us that if you do these things, they are going to be more motivating to our students. But we thought, okay, it's great that he's telling us that, but let's check and see if it actually is motivating to our students. And then the other piece is we also wanted to check with our staff, is it doable, right? We ask a ton of our teachers, and these equitable grading practices, even though, yes, they're probably better for students, we wanted to make sure that it wasn't going to run them raw and it wasn't going to overwhelm them with, getting this huge influx of late work at the last minute or constantly working with students to reassess when they need to move forward with the other students that are ready to move forward. So the survey results, at Liberty, we ended up getting 62% of our students to respond to, which we feel pretty good about that. And what they overall feeling is that the equitable grading practices that we were implementing were motivating to them, and I'll show you some of those survey results here in a little bit. And then also another key thing to point out is we've been doing these 20-minute conversations where we give teachers essentially an open opportunity to touch base with some of the principals in our building, and they can talk about anything. One thing that was constant that came up was our grading practices, and they felt really good about them, but there was some recommendations that they gave us, so much to the point where before the year ended, and I think we implemented maybe right at the start of third trimester, but we actually made some mid-year tweaks to our grading policy that made it more manageable for our teachers. So instead of having it wide open and allow our students to turn in late work up until the end of the trimester, we set a deadline on that, and we moved it to the end of the unit, right? So that way they can kind of conclude everything from a teacher standpoint, from a student standpoint, shift gears and move on to the new stuff. And then we also put in some parameters around the reassessment, so they're not waiting all trimester to do the reassessment, but they're doing it within a 2-week window following receiving their score back on that assessment. So again, it just made it more manageable for the teachers, but at the same time, it also goes back to some of those soft skills that we're also trying to work with our students on in terms of being able to meet deadlines and to adhere to those deadlines. So it was kind of that happy medium between, doing what's best for the students, but at the same time still having those high standards for the students as well and making it manageable for our teachers. I had mentioned the summer ILT retreat, but we took that data, we looked at it as an entire group, and then we were kind of making our tweaks to our grading policy that's constantly in motion in between the years, and it'll obviously reflect those updates we did mid-year, and we also implemented some more consistency at the secondary level across our buildings, so then we reflect those changes as well. All right, so the last 2 slides I'm going to show is just some general things. So what I did on the survey is we did a 5-point Likert scale. So anything above 2.5 you're feeling pretty good about. So this one's specific to do you believe that your grades are helping motivate you to learn? So the overall mean was 3.65, and we broke it out across different demographic groups, and it was pretty consistent throughout. So whether you're looking at white students, whether you're looking at Asian students, whether you're looking at males or females or a 9th grader or a 12th grader, it was consistent across the board, kind of in that 3.65 range. So overall, students are feeling like they're motivated. What I think is really important to highlight, though, is this next one. I know it's a lot of stuff here, so I'm just going to point out kind of what it all means. But what we did is we broke down our 7 most common grading practices that are part of our grading policy, and we asked students, and I guess I should emphasize too, we put it up against the traditional grading practice. So for example, teacher accepting late work would be an equitable grading practice. The counterpart on the traditional side would be teacher not accepting late work, and we're asking students, well, which is more motivational to you, in regards to your learning? And you can see, so all of the equitable grading practices are on a green line, and then all of the traditional are on, I guess I'm not good with colors, like a light red color, What color is that, Carmen? You good? Orange? I don't know. Yeah, orange. We'll say orange. But you can see, so a 3.97 mean average compared with the 2.73. So students, for the most part, are overwhelmingly identifying those equitable grading practices as being more motivational, with the exception of two. Okay, there's one around percentage of your final grade with homework, and that's something we explored around with, and that's one we're gonna move a little bit and see if we can find that happy medium, that it's manageable for teachers. It obviously focuses on learning, but then it also motivates the students to actually do that practice work. And then the other one had to do with academic honesty. And this one's not surprising, whether you don't penalize with the grade, give a kid another opportunity, or do you just give them an F and you move on? So it's one from a philosophy standpoint that's really difficult for us, but we did find out that that one wasn't a motivating practice. So we're working with our staff to put together an academic honesty policy that's gonna make it more specific, and again, try to find that happy medium for our students that will allow them to be held to a high standard, but at the same time focus on the learning too. So any questions with that? I know that's a lot of data on that last one, so I apologize for all of the numbers that are on that slide.
I was wondering about the academic honesty aspect, so I'm glad that you brought that up.
Yep. Yeah, I think that's one that we've struggled with a little bit, and it's one we've stayed away from at this time from a uniform secondary policy, but it's something that we're kind of struggling with within our building to find the right policy, and I know Weston City are having similar conversations on that one too.
So the total N on this survey was 746 students, is that correct?
Yeah, 746 of our 1,200 students at Liberty, so about 62% of the students responded.
The others didn't respond, or they didn't?
Some of them started the survey and then they didn't complete it. We obviously don't force the students to do it. We just recommend, hey, we'd love your feedback. So yeah, about 62% of them decided to complete the survey for us.
Okay.
And sorry, I missed what you said about is it the 15% one you said there was some pushback on? And-
Yeah, yep.
Okay, what
It-
was the pushback generally? Because I know I've heard it too.
Yeah,
From my
so-
own kids.
Yep, so generally what it is initially is the thought is, right, with homework or practice work, it's just about practice. You're learning those skills, and we shouldn't be assigning any type of grade because we want you to fail, we want you to struggle through it, and then your grade's gonna be coming on that assessment later on. But what we found, especially in classes like math, that if there's not any type of grade that they're getting, even though if it'll help them on the assessment, the students aren't completing that. So that's the feedback that we got from our teachers, is that they're not completing the homework if there's not a certain percentage. So what we're trying to do now is move that needle and find out what percentage is it that's gonna be motivating to the kids, that it doesn't maybe cover up what they actually know at the end of the unit with that assessment. So I think where we settled is we're landed somewhere around 25% is what we're gonna try this next year. And hopefully that'll be a high enough percentage for the kids to motivate them to do it, but doesn't take away from what they actually know at the end of the unit too.
I was interested in the universal expectation about comparison. Don't assign grade based on their achievement. How does that look in practice, in everyday practice, when, like, say, a social studies class or something? What does that look like at Liberty? How do they do that?
Are you talking the ones in terms of not comparing to their peers? Yep. So I think a lot of times, and I'm speaking for myself as a classroom teacher, you have this general understanding of how ninth grade U.S. history or American studies students should be performing, and you have that standard in your mind, and if that kid is scoring, I don't know, say a 90%, and then you have a certain number of kids that are at 90%, a certain number of kids that are 80%, a certain number of kids that are at 70%, right? You have that nice bell curve. So I think what it is removing that piece of it and just saying, here's the rubric that we have, okay? And if they're meeting that skills, and if it's 90% of the kids that are scoring at 90%, that's the way it should be. You're not comparing it across to their peers, but you're using that set standard, so a rubric or however you're grading that assessment.
So basically, no grading on a curve.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Don't write the test so hard that so some people aren't going to pass it, or, with that being your intention. just,
Yep.
okay. And, okay, that makes, yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that. Now it makes sense to me. At first, I was like, wait a minute, how are you gonna do that? So
Yeah.
if this is when we're asking the questions about, I just wanna go back to the homework one. We said that it's not equitable to expect kids to do homework because they don't have a place to do it. But then we're saying, but we wanna maybe increase the amount of homework to count as 25% of their grade. I'm just not seeing how all this fits together
Yep,
with the
that's-
homework and practice
Yeah,
part.
and that's a struggle that our instructional leadership team had when we were having this discussion too, is right, is there's been numerous studies that have shown that homework isn't effective. So what,
You say that though to people like, you know, because I've heard it, I've repeated it, but if you say it to people my age, the parents are like, well, that's impossible.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So like, there's a real learning curve
Yep.
for me on this one to even. It's so easy for you to be like, how's that possible?
yeah, so what we talked about more is we moved away from using the word homework and more to classwork or practice work. So it's stuff that the teachers are giving their students time in class. And then if it's a set number of time and we know that those students are gonna be able to complete that work in that time that's allotted to them, they're not taking into consideration, okay, they got 80% of it done, now they have to finish that last 20% of the classwork at home, figuring out a way that they're not factoring that into the grade. Does that make sense? So distinguishing between homework and practice work or homework and classwork.
Well, and I think the careful balance, like you can all think about this as a student too, right? Like you probably had a course at some time in your existence, you passed the course because you did all the homework, not because you performed great on the tests, right? And so if the test is supposed to be the measure of learning, but really the reason you passed the course is because you completed all of the tasks in the homework, did you really learn? You know, and I think that's back to the root of the learning. And then, you know, I know at some point, you know, people get worked up about the word privilege and what that means. Well, if we have a kid that passes all the tests but doesn't complete all the homework for whatever reason is in their way, but they fail the class, does that make any sense? That they can pass the assessments, but because they didn't complete all the task-based activities within there? And I think that's what Justin's saying, is there's got to be a right balance, right? We have to still motivate them to do the practice with something, but the practice can't be weighted so heavily that if you don't do it, you can't pass the course, even though you could probably have your learning reflected on the summative assessments. And I think just even from a student-based experience, we can all probably relate to that in some level where we've been in those situations differently.
I think then that points to the need for better assessment too.
Yeah.
Because you have those kids that, you know, do all the work, but can't do, well, we don't use Scantron testing anymore, but I mean, you know, you have to figure out different ways to assess kids, which I know everybody's really working on. I mean,
Yeah.
I think that's a crucial part of that, is I had to get my head around that. How do I tell that hardworking kid that doesn't do well on tests, sorry, you're not gonna get a good grade, even though you used to be able to get a good grade that way?
That's my concern too. And also, you know, when we're talking about like executive function skills and AVID and everything, I thought practice is supposed to be done perfectly. Perfect practice makes perfect, right? Not just practice. And so if we don't assess practice, then how do you get good at practice? And don't you just stop practicing, or don't you, what's the word that's not half-assed, because it wouldn't have that word in it? Can't think of one. So you don't half-ass your homework, because half-ass practice makes half-ass, right? So I mean, that's the problem I keep on going to, and I know I haven't taught in a long time, so it's hard for me to understand this, but it just seems like we're putting a ton of pressure on us, on academia to nail assessment, because wow, you're putting it all at the end.
Yep.
And by that
But I
time-
don't think it's
But
all at the end.
not-
I think it's finding the right
projects,
balance, right?
It's tests,
Yeah.
it's other cumulative sort of things to show that you know the standards. So it's not just the test. It's assessment also would include projects that you do,
That's
Papers
different
in
than
English
practice
class.
work and homework. That's
Yeah.
different.
yeah, yeah.
That also suggests to me that actually we might look at providing time in classroom, which all kids have access to, right, for doing practice work.
We do, yeah.
So that we're not separating out kids, you know, who have good practice places to go to, and kids that don't have that, so.
Yeah, Charlie, I think that's a really good point, and that's one thing with that classwork and distinguishing between, you know, somewhere at home, working at it at home, because you do have access to that teacher. right? That highly skilled teacher that's in the classroom that can provide that level of support that every student is gonna have access to, as opposed to maybe just some of the privileged students that may be at home, you know, and have access to that tutor or a parent that's, you know, available to assist them with it.
Right.
Yeah,
And a parent that understands the subject matter.
yeah, yeah.
So let me get this straight. So this is a part of our process, measuring, getting us towards a standards-based system. Or is it more, this is what things are going to look like using a traditional grading system, but we're going to kind of standards-y it. I don't know, think that standards-y is a word. Do you hear what I'm saying? Like to me, I'm a little confused because this sounds like A, B, C, D, F, and we just need to figure out what's the 25% or 15%, rather than you understand the stuff, therefore you are proficient, therefore we don't need A, B, C, D, because they don't tell us very much, but proficient or does tell us.
And that's always the $1,000 question, right, is does this mean we're switching and transitioning to standards-based grading? And what does that then mean for our students within our system? So, but before we can do that, before we can say yes to that, we have to identify what those standards are. And Carmen's going to be touching on that here in a little bit. What I can confidently say is in the fall of 25-26, when our middle schools are in their second year, our goal is that beginning in the 25-26 school year, given the fact that we've embedded our sixth graders into that middle school setting who are currently functioning more on a standards-based grading approach, is that all 6th, 7th, and 8th graders across our district will be assessed through the standards-based grading system. Then we have to work within our teaching staff, establish those priority standards, the proficiency scales, as well as common assessments before we can get there with our high schools, because we know types of controversies that have occurred within districts across the state or across the country when they transition to standards-based grading without proper communication to the community about what that means for students then after. So before I can say, yes, this means we're transitioning here, we know that there's a lot of work between A and B to be done.
And it's really, sorry, JP, the thing I'd say is I would just stay anchored in what we're really trying to do at this point is make sure that a kid's grade is reflective of what they've learned, right? And I think we can, again, all kind of think about that probably wasn't true. It was a ton of behavior, right? Really what was measured in that grade was all behavior. And we don't even know if it was their behavior or how they were getting those answers or how they were completing those compliance-based tests. So we're trying to find a sweet spot, if you will, about, okay, what is the right balance to be able to measure the student's learning? And then I do think naturally, like Director Clausen saying, some questions come up about, well, then what do these letter grades mean? I mean, our system is linked to letter grades. I mean, our college, university admissions, all of those things. So we're not necessarily saying that, but it is the right question because it's what's prompted. And I think that's a nice segue in the presentation to what Carmen's talking about what does HRS tell us? What does high reliability schools show us? And that's the link to standards, because standards are the things the kids should learn. So our grades should reflect, okay, what was their performance on those standards? And then how does that start to shift as a system? So maybe we can transition to that part.
So I will start first just by connecting it to the HRS part, and then I'll go more into what we're doing right now with the curriculum focus. But with the HRS, even with level 1 for this year, where our main center was focusing on that professional learning, I mean, in addition to safe, supportive, collaborative cultures, we really had a high emphasis on professional learning communities. And so really going through across the district and establishing in every building those professional learning groups where teachers could get together and go through the 4 essential questions. What do we want students to know, be able to do and understand? How do we know they know it? So how are we assessing their learning? What do we do if they don't? So what are we doing to build some interventions and support around that learning when students have not achieved proficiency yet? And then what do we do if they do know it already? And so how can we extend that learning or expand that learning for the students who have already achieved mastery while you're still teaching that content? And so the big piece of that was this year was really getting the teams together at buildings level and at district level to focus on those 4 questions in those PLCs and determine how can we support the learning for all of our students, and how can we build some consistency across the board, district-wide, to make sure we all understand what our students are supposed to be able to know, do, and understand in every single curriculum area. And so a lot of the work that we did for level 1 centered in, from our end, from the curriculum teams, the coordinators, was working around building that priority standards to answer question number 1 of the PLC cycle. What should students know, be able to do, and understand? And we have done that district-wide to establish that work. And so question 2 then focuses on how do we know they know it? How are we assessing student learning? How can students themselves assess their mastery and assess their ability or their knowledge that they have achieved understanding of the content? And so that's going to fall into our space of priority standards. with the proficiency skills and then some of those common assessments. And so that's where level 3 will also kick in. While we're working on that level 2, and that's our goal for next year with HRS, effective teaching in every classroom, that aligns to the work that we're doing with equitable practices for grading, because we're looking at how we build and support across the system for students to get the knowledge and the understanding that they need, and how we're supporting that when they don't have it. What are we doing to really engage students so they're active participants in their learning? How do students assess their own learning, their own growth, and can really establish, like, I know it, I don't know it yet, but I know what I have to do in order to achieve this is what we consider a called proficiency. And how are students helping, how are teachers helping students to get there? By providing effective feedback. And so that can either go through the proficiency skills helps with that effective feedback, or formative assessments that we're doing regularly to assess students' understanding of their content knowledge. So as we work through the level 3 of guaranteed and viable curriculum, which is the work we want to do district-wide, making sure that all teachers across the district really know what students are supposed to know in every single curriculum area. And we also understand what is proficiency. How do we know, or where can we establish the guidelines to say we have met this benchmark? This is what we consider proficient. This is what is above proficiency, and here's what we say that students still have not achieved proficiency yet. And as a collective team, what do we have in place to guide students towards proficiency and provide support for that? So with the Guaranteed and Viable Curriculum district-wide, we have, that commitment is to have district-wide priority standards, a district-wide scope and sequence for every curriculum area, proficiency skills that meet for each priority standard, and also district-wide common assessments for each grading period. So in this case, at least a common assessments for every trimester, at the end of every trimester. This helps in 2 ways if we do it every trimester. One, because the students are in a trimester-based class, we have an understanding of how they achieve proficiency at the end of that trimester for each of the courses that they're in. And if students are in a year-long course, but they transition from one teacher to the next, in between trimesters, it helps us to fully understand then, have they gained proficiency of that content knowledge per trimester before they transition to the next teacher? And can that teacher provide support for them when they're in the next area? So for the work that we're doing around proficiency skills and priority standards, as teachers work in building collaborative teams and also in district-wide teams, the goal is that students will come into every single class knowing for sure what their learning target is. So they have a full understanding that this is what we're learning today, this is what proficiency looks like in this learning, and this is how I would know that I've achieved proficiency. Teachers will also be able to do a quick formative assessment to understand if students have gained that knowledge at the end of the, either end of the day, end of the week, or end of whatever that grading period is, and provide interventions when needed. But then they'll also have the ability to communicate in their learning groups, in the professional learning communities, to figure out how to best support students towards their learning. Teachers also have that time and that space to really work on best practices for whatever the curriculum area is, and talk how they're teaching and how they're helping students engage in their learning, how they're grading students, how they're providing the support, and how they're building interventions collectively to help the students across the board. So that's the main piece of that, is just really, not only will students know what is expected of them and what proficiency looks like for them, but it also helps for parents to also know how to best support their students and guide them towards that level of proficiency in the content area. And so this is one of the biggest pieces of providing that, when we're talking about the proficiency skills with regards to standards-based learning, or standards-based grading, to not only see it as a grading concept, but also to see it as a way to provide effective feedback for students, and to empower students to just take charge of their own learning and their own growth in that learning progress. So for HRS, for that level 3, this year we really focused on building the priority standards district-wide, and so that was the one thing that we did achieve for every curriculum area. The collaborative teams, the teacher teams, were able to build priority standards that we're going to have now ready for principals and for all students to have access to in the buildings. This year, now we're going to pull some teacher teams together to work on building a scope and sequence so we can know for sure exactly when each priority center is being taught in the school year. And then we're also building proficiency skills that aligns with every single priority standard. So whatever that learning target is, students can come into a classroom right away knowing, here's my learning goal for the day, and here's how I know that I've achieved proficiency for this learning target. And so they can align those two and be a part of their own learning for that moment. And then finally, our next step for the future is then to start working on common assessments. And so the goal is to build common summative assessments for every every grading period. And before we jump into that, is the biggest piece of what Charlie and what Matt said, I'm sorry, about just really focusing on validity and reliability of assessments. So really, how do we do assessment design? How to create the best assessment to determine student learning, and how students have achieved understanding of the goal. And so that's the work that we're looking at forward in the near future with this. But next year's work is really going to be focusing on the scope and sequence and proficiency skills. I'll go ahead and that.
So, Carmen, apologize for asking this very rudimentary question. What's the difference between a formative and a summative assessment?
The formative assessments are your quick checks. And so that's like, on a scale of 1 to 5, how well do you understand what we're learning today? It could be a quick quiz,
Oh,
it
so
could be a quick activity that you're doing with students, a quick show of understanding. Where your summative assessments, you're really assessing their learning of an extended period.
Oh, thank you very
And a
much.
combination of collective
Great,
standards.
thanks.
It's a good question, because here's the thing, even though I've got kids that are in secondary, I'm not in the room like you guys are. So and like what you just said about, no, they have projects. It's really helpful to simplify all of this for people that aren't as in it as you guys are. I mean, we really need to hear that, kind of like that thing what you just said about how we do these assessments is in between, you know? And they may not be graded, but the teacher is thinking, okay, this kid gets it, so we can move on with that kid, or this kid needs an intervention. It's just simplifying it for lay people is just really helpful to hear how that works, because otherwise you hear it from your kid. And I mean, you're not getting the whole story. I mean, they tell you all sorts of, you know, like, we just had one test the whole year and everything is based on this test, you know?
And I just want to echo, like, Carmen's work, the curriculum coordinator's work, our teachers' work, just within the last year to do the work that they've done is absolutely amazing, that they accomplish as much as they have in 1 year. Over the course of the next 1 to 2 years, it's going to be amazing to see the work that's being done for the sake of our students within our buildings. And so much has been done to talk about, you know, the level 3, the curriculum and the assessments that are being used and that are around our district and in our buildings. But I'm excited about our work next year, looking at level 2, that highly effective instruction within our classrooms. So the best indicator of student achievement is that teacher that's in the classroom. And we're really looking forward to introducing what NASOT is, the new art and science of teaching, what highly effective teaching strategies look like. And just like a student really thrives on feedback about what high instruction looks like, we're really excited about becoming better coaches as administrators about how we can provide that feedback to our teachers. So, you know, we've focused a lot on level 1, level 3, but we're really excited also about level 2 that's going to start next year with our teachers that are in the classroom, because we already have amazing teachers and we're going to have even better ones over the course of the next few years. And then, you know, just to close, I apologize that this graphic's a little blurry, but kind of touches on what Justin had referenced within what's being done at Liberty. And what we found, and what I found this year, working with our secondary principals, is the desire for consistency across our entire system. That just like a student in one classroom to the next, thrive on consistency, that's the best for them. 11 to 18-year-olds need a consistent approach between what instruction looks like, what assessment looks like. Just like that is best for students, that's also best for our buildings. So a student at Liberty shouldn't have a different experience than a student at West, than a different student at City, as well as our junior highs or online program at Tate. So they have the desire to make sure that we have a consistent approach to what grading looks like within our buildings. And what we did in the spring about our last 3 or 4 meetings was like, all right, you guys have talked about consistency, now we need to get down to it. So these are the big things of what grading for equity looks like, and we didn't just copy and paste about what the research said is best to what we're gonna do in Iowa City. Now, we took that as a starting point, but based upon the experiences within their building, what administrators have seen working with their teachers, the experience of the students, what the feedback was that they heard back from families, we took all of that and then decided on, all right, what are we all gonna stay in line with across all of our secondary schools? And that's what you see an example here. We just finished this up before the end of the school year. And what I tasked our administrators to do before teachers left for the year is to make sure that when they're starting to plan during the summer, hopefully they're taking that well-deserved time off, but as they start to plan for next school year, is that they have a good idea of what is going to be the expectation of them. So everybody within our entire secondary school system, it has the same philosophy about what grading looks like within their classroom. So I'm really excited about that, and you can kind of see what that is going to be across our secondary school system.
About this, I was talking to a teacher this week who I live with about this. And we both were a little confused on the late work because the last sentence, right, says a student's final score should not be penalized or points reduced for late work. But then the two sentences before that put guardrails on when late work is accepted. So does that last sentence apply to late work submitted within the policy?
Correct.
Okay.
So, Justin had mentioned, we need to be mindful of what's best for kids, but also what's also feasible for the teacher in the classroom. And we put that was a big piece of what our administrators discussed, is something that was assigned during the first week of the school year, then all of a sudden, the end of the trimester is near, then all of a sudden, they're not even anywhere near close to what that's the unit that's covering, that we need to have some parameters in there that's feasible with the kids, the expectations for the kids, but also that make it feasible for the staff. And if it's well down the road from the trimester, that doesn't do any good, because we need that consistent feedback to see how our students are performing, that are going to ultimately alter instruction and determine what those next steps are for students that need either intervention or extension within the classroom.
With the retake is one thing we heard at my kids' school, is that, the kids get competitive with each other. And if one of them has a teacher that allows retakes under certain circumstances and the other doesn't, it can get pretty frustrating for the kids. And I know HRS, you're trying to have this consistency. It's a big part of your presentation. I think consistency in every school is good, but also consistency with all three schools is really important, because, again, people get competitive about this stuff, and it does end up being a big deal. For example, if one teacher has a policy where if you get a C, you can't retake, because it's good enough,
Yep.
But the teacher that's teaching the same class in another period lets you retake it till and you can get an A, and it counts as an A. They don't take an average. That's the kind of stuff that I hope we can avoid,
Yep.
so that the kids aren't distracted by that. And let's just have a, policy that works across the board.
Yep.
Well, and I think that goes back to the baby steps they were talking about, because before, there was any boundaries around it. You might have a teacher that would do retakes wide open, and another teacher wouldn't even do a retake, wouldn't even allow one, right? And so it's trying to get, everybody coalesced around the idea that having a retake policy is important, having a late homework policy is important, right? Rather than, some that are all over the place. And so, I mean, the thing, this topic always, two thoughts it kind of generates for me. One is like, you kind of know if you're cut out to be a teacher if you work through this presentation and you're still talking about it and hanging with it and excited about it, right? Because this is part of what we do outside of the relationships with kids, right? Like, you have to kind of love this stuff, right, around your content area. The other part of it is thinking about the role of a teacher and just how dynamic it is and how much it's changed. I think about my career, 20 years in education, and we were just starting to get standards from the state. Before that, it was, here's your textbook, just go for it, right? You didn't have any boundaries. So when we're talking about guaranteed viable curriculum and what the standards, the priority standards from the standards are, I mean, we were operating in the wild, wild west, here as of 20 years ago. So you think about some veteran teacher, right, that has seen that whole transition. I mean, there are a lot of feelings around this work, right, from the autonomy that maybe was there at one time to what they're being asked to do today. That role has changed tremendously in what they're being asked to do and the things they're being asked to think about, how to assess kids, how to assess their learning, what the standards they should be teaching and when they should be teaching them are. So it is a big change for our staff and something I don't think we can take lightly that way. But in the end, we know what we're doing is good for kids. And so that's kind of the driver of the work. It's just the kind of the ugliness or the sausage being made to get there.
And ultimately, a student's fortune should not be determined who the computer spits out that they have for that class, right? So
Right.
the desire that one classroom to the next, the approach that we're going to take from an assessment standpoint is the exact same. There's nothing worse than leading a building than getting a phone call that said, well, my student's friend, my child's friend, their teacher allows this, but you don't allow this. So
I didn't make that call, just.
I'm not pointing anybody out.
That was a great presentation.
Yeah, it's exciting, and I do, I'll just briefly, because I could dig in for hours on this, but what I really appreciate when I ask a question about standards, it's like, here's the process to get there, right? Because, teaching a district that has standards in a high school, some people do it and some people don't, and there's no policy about it, it's just completely random. And going in, and there isn't a scope and sequence necessarily for everything. So as a teacher, you kind of have to make it up what you're going to call proficient, and then in the next teacher, it's 70%. And so, and as a teacher, I would prefer a policy, some guardrails. Well, here's how we do it. This is what proficient means in language arts in 9th grade. Here's what we're looking at. Whether you're going to do Romeo and Juliet or another play, we need the kids to do this skill. And it's going to take time because kids the number of students I've seen who are high achieving, who don't care one bit about the content, they only care about the score. Please stop explaining it to me. What is the answer? I have to put it in this blank because I need this. And that's undergraduates. So we've created a culture that doesn't care about content. We only care about a number. And however you get there, it doesn't matter. And colleges reinforce that, right? It's reinforced all the way through until you get to the workplace and they're like, you don't know anything. And then you look at the CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, a significant number of them never went to college. And they're the CEO of a Fortune 500 company because they only care, can you do the thing we need you to do? I don't care where you went to college. I don't care. Can you do the thing we need you to do whatever? And that's truly where we need to get to. But it's going to take time. And we're going to have to train our families. We're going to have to train our kids to shift that thinking. Or what?
Our colleges.
And our colleges I think they'll get the hint because it's money.
Actually,
Oh, true.
the college right here in town is University of Iowa, and I was going to ask this. Have we talked to the biggest college at the University of Iowa, CLAS, College of Liberal Arts and Sciences? They're doing some really exciting work, very similar to this. And so I think that might be a worthy conversation to have because they're taking a look at trying to eliminate the curve, taking a look at students are paying a lot of money for these courses. Do you really want to fail them? Do you want to ensure that they're mastering the information? And so they're doing a huge rework on that, and her name is Cornelia Lang. Just don't tell her I told you to call her.
Well, and here's the other thing that, because I hope they are doing that right, because in content, it's admissions that's going to have to really figure this out, because that's going to be the tricky piece, because they need some quick information. And we're all net, but I appreciate that here in this district, we're going slow to go fast. We're taking our time, we're laying the groundwork. I do think as a board, one thing we're going to have to think about if we're going to provide a guaranteed and viable curriculum is flexibility on time. Because not all students will learn the same thing in 13 years. It's silly to pretend they do. But we give them all the same number of hours, we give them all the same time. But people learn at different rates. So I think we're going to have to get creative in how we structure the calendar and structure our time to provide those excelled experiences for kids who need it, those experiences where they need some extra support. We're going to have to find time to do that because it can't just be you're always in this thing at this time on this day because everybody's different. And I think that's going to be our challenge as a board is how do we structure that and build it into because we're not going to get more days in our calendar, right? I doubt that. So how do we take those days we have in our calendar and structure them in a way to really target all of those kids? But I like this go slow. We're going to show, because if I'm a new teacher coming in, rather than saying, here's the textbook, go read the core standards, figure it out. It's like, here you go. Here's some guardrails. Have the autonomy, right? We want you to be creative in the classroom. We want you to do all the creative things teachers do. And then here are the guardrails to guide that work. And I again, it's 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 years out, I think, until we're all starting to speak language. I appreciate the formative and summative. That's just an always reminder for anyone in education. Anytime you have an acronym, spell that out. Anytime we use educational jargon, spell it out because it is confusing for folks. But it's exciting. And not just exciting, it feels like we're doing this in a sustainable way. Mm-hmm. It feels like we're doing this for the long haul, so we outlast this board and all the folks in the room doing the work that we're not going to see necessarily the benefit of. And that's what we need to do, otherwise we're going to spin our wheels and wait for the next thing. So thank you again.
The consistency piece is so important. I see how this ties in with HRS and our strategic plan so nicely. And just like we've done with the discipline first, we've been consistent across the district with the discipline, and now we're doing the same with this. I like how you've incorporated the student voice and the continuous improvement piece. And I'm really glad that you brought up, obviously grades are important. Everybody knows grades are important, but I really regret that that's the focus, right? And I'm kind of hopeful that this might shift our culture a little bit into focusing more on the learning. One question, well, two questions I had, but you already answered, and this is some of the pushback that I'm hearing in the community is the real life skills. Are we teaching our kids time management? But I think that the latest iteration where you've kind of tightened that up, that brings in that time management piece, and then the policy that you're going to form on the academic integrity, I think that's very important. So thank you.
So as I was saying, that's if I could segue from that, we need to understand, and we need the community to understand it, because we do get tons of questions. And this was very helpful, but I would love it if there was like a info sheet, or you know what I mean, like something that I could say, hey, I know this is complicated, and the board also really needed to learn about it. So here's what I'm going to read that Feldman book, but not everybody's going to read that book, okay? So if we could have some talking points about how to answer those questions, there are going to be some you can't answer yet. I totally get it. But to say like, hey, this is the goal, and it's what you said, right? It's all about are our kids actually learning? That's what we want to assess. Putting it under that umbrella and then helping the community understand that better is really important. And then I'm just going to reiterate the consistency piece is so important. So, so important.
Something like a one-pager, and I don't know what you call it, standard, I don't know if you want to use lingo, but compare, here's traditional grading versus learning for mastery, and just something real simple, pros and cons, or, just to tick down and just be like, here's our graphic that, and for me, I'd love to see, like, the graphic with a little bar that's growing so we know how close we're getting. But I'm a gamer, so it's like our health bar. I just want to see it go up until it's all filled out.
And to communicate to the students too, not just at the beginning of the year or the beginning of the trimester, but just continuously reminding them of policy, because I think it gets confusing for them as well.
That's a good idea.
Yeah.
I want to ask kind of a processed question. These are asking a lot of teachers. And I think you've done a great presentation, and you're doing great work on recognizing that and working with teaching staff to take this direction, okay? But I would like to actually, is Brady still here? Yeah, Brady's here, right?
Can't see you behind Les.
I'm behind Les.
And I recognize Superintendent Degner, and I'm not supposed to go around you, and I'm not trying to. No, I'm not. I'm sure you would do the same thing. Do we have processes that we're fairly comfortable with that say that the teaching staff who has questions about the late work or any other part of this set of requirements, that their expressions of doubt or uncertainty or downright disagreement can be heard and recognized, respected, and incorporated into what's happening. And I don't know if the EA has I guess I'm asking you, Brady, if the EA has formulated a process for making that available to teachers if they want to do it through the EA instead of through the.
Yeah, we have, thanks, Director Easton. We have not, through the ICEA, really addressed that. But I would say, your instructional leadership teams, the ILTs, at every secondary school have really been like the core group that has been involved in the work, in addition to the cohort that they had with the folks who were doing a deeper dive. I think some of the HRS survey questions would relate to this that we were asked about our buildings in the beginning of last year, and then the 20-minute conversations as well. I think, as Justin had mentioned, there was a lot of conversation that came from those. So you probably saw in your departments and your professional learning communities within those departments some conversations and some moves toward more consistent practices, because I think that's where the inconsistency would probably be most visible, or most immediately visible, is if one Algebra 1 teacher does something and the different Algebra 1 teacher, has a different, a way of doing it. So I think you're seeing the secondary schools build out more time for professional learning communities to meet and then have those conversations around the 4 questions that Carmen, articulated. So. I think that there is. I appreciate that we asked the students about what was motivating and that we got feedback from that. I think the fact that you've seen, just even on our timeline, of course, I'm at Liberty, so this is all, second nature to me in terms of parts of this presentation. But I think the changes that have happened in the policies as we've lived with them a little bit and as we've refined them based on feedback from families and students and staff reflect that I do think that there's a healthy way for people to give feedback. It's not easy. I mean, I would say, like, you put this up there and we sort of do this really fast and we say, and then we have priority standards and we're gonna have scope and sequence and it's a massive lift. I mean, it really is a tremendous amount of work that everybody here is doing and that the teachers are doing, the building administrators, are doing. I think the question about us versus the national, test writers is really interesting. I will say, as an AP advanced placement teacher, one of the things that I really love about the course that I teach is that the framework for it is very well developed. I mean, so I know the standards, I know the proficiency scales, I know what students are going to have to be able to do, but that is a monumental effort across the nation, and it's a multi-year effort. So looking at their product, I showed that as a product to the social studies teachers at the secondary level and said, well, it would be awesome to get something like this in all of our courses, but that's a lot of time and a lot of energy, a lot of work that we're committed to, but it just doesn't happen overnight. So, yeah, I do. I mean, a lot of our Thursday conversations that we have in our professional development time are focused on this. I mean, as you can imagine, grading and assessing is, I think, as everyone say, yeah, that's we're invested in that conversation, all of the time. I've appreciated that there have been some refinements made in both directions on the policies, and I think that reflects the input that staff and students have had. So, and I think the input that you all get from families is important as well. I think so. This conversation is a really important one. So,
I guess to interject also, the work that's being done to help support the teachers, Anna Austin, who works with our secondary instructional coaches, her and I went to every single one of our secondary buildings multiple times this year to talk through what is the instructional coach process look like within their building. We're focusing a little bit on how do they help support our PLCs within the building, but also as part of that conversation was how do you support teachers in their coaching conversations. And we have many of our coaches that are working with their teachers looking specifically at their grading policies and practices within their classroom. So that support is there when those staff members opt in to those types of support or to those instructional strategies to best support the needs of their kids.
yeah, and I would just say, too, I think that with the coaching, helping with that, I think the thing that's the value of the coaching is, and the way we frame this, is that you don't feel as if when you're trying new things and as you're working with your department or with your professional learning community team, you feel, empowered to try new things because you're thinking, okay, we all have the same goals, and that's to have a more equitable grading practice and assessment, process. And it's okay if we're going to try something that's a little bit different and then come back together at the end of a trimester, at the end of a year, and share some of the results so that we can learn and get better. And I think that, and when we framed it that way, and we've gone a little bit slower in that, knowing where our end goal is, I think that empowers people. And I think there's more buy-in because people who might have been resistant otherwise are willing to say, okay, yeah, I'll try this, and then we're going to come back together. I trust all of you. We're going to share the results and, see what it did for student outcomes.
Great.
Great.
Thanks, Brady. Sorry.
Thank you so much. As you can see, that was a very great presentation and something that I think all of the directors were invested in, and I have a feeling that when the community listened to that part, they will be invested as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right.
Next up, we have our Save Fund presentation by Mr. Finger, CFO Finger. But I think they broke the computer.
Oh, there it is.
It was.
Presentation.
Yeah, it was, right.
I have so many questions and a lot of it is answered for me.
All right.
While Les is pulling that one up, this is a follow-up to some conversations we've specifically had about before and after school programs at our district buildings and how the 21st Century Grant provides some scholarship spots for students. We know that the fund that houses those grant funds is the SAVE Fund, and what we had offered to you guys was kind of give you an accounting of what's in that SAVE Fund. And so really tonight, it's not a decision point. There isn't really much discussion we're looking for from the board, but what we wanted to provide is kind of an education component around what is in the SAVE Fund, so that then you'd have some time to wrestle with that and come back to me or to the table eventually with any thoughts you may have about that. But first, we kind of wanted you to have a good frame of reference about what is in the SAVE Fund, what's it used for, where might there be some parts that there's some negotiation, and where are there parts that there are not, really room for negotiation on it. So Les, go ahead.
Thanks, Matt. So you have up here on the screen a 6-year review of the SAVE Fund and how those resources have come in, as well as the bottom half here, I'll slide it down in a minute, how those resources have been used. So you can see 17-18 was a big year, but we sold $30,000 of SAVE revenue bonds that year. That was the last year before we did SAVE borrowing before the general obligation bond passed, and then we switched to that to fund FMP 1.0. Then again, as we hit into FMP 2.0, now you'll see in 22-23 on the right-hand column there, the borrowings there as we move into that plan, and most of that is, our middle school conversions that we're going on at the 3 junior highs right now. In between there, then you have the revenues that were received, and you can see it was pretty consistent on the SAVE revenues. But then in 21-22, it jumped, and there's not really a solid reason why it jumped there, but that was when the pandemic was happening. Everybody was staying home. They weren't taking their money outside of the state, and they were doing all those home projects, spending it here. And so actually, sales tax revenues jumped in the state that year, and so we were fortunate to see that little bit of a spike. Now the 22-23, that was the estimate that the state gave us that's in there. I think that's going to be closer to 17 million when we get done. So actually 22-23, since it's based upon actual and not an estimate as we go through the year, is actually going to stay fairly strong. So that number will probably turn out to be better than that when we get all said and done. How do we spend those resources? Well, obviously, the biggest thing that we have to do is, since we borrowed those SAVE revenue bonds going back to 2015, 2 years before this schedule starts, but those pay off all the way through 2029. And so that debt service has to be the first thing that comes out of any of those resources from a compliance perspective. So that's an untouchable, if you will. And then the next line there that's broken out is technology. The SAVE Fund, the revenue purpose statement that's been in place for our voters all along has provided technology in the revenue purpose statement. And this is our primary source for all of the equipment that we use for our teachers, our classroom, and our staff across the district. So that's everything from the one-on-ones to the teacher devices to the computer that I use are all funded out of there. Across the district. And you will see the spike there in the middle, the 7.7 million. That was when we adopted the one-on-one for all of the elementaries. And it just happened all fall in that year, and then you see the next year we dropped off. So you kind of got to average those 2 years there to see that we're pretty much in line there. We are continuing to project that. Director Kurth and his team and the IT department have a budget that they work with and have a detailed line item. We don't put it in here per se, but they have that as with all of the life cycle and everything for both the student and staff computers. And so they're on that trajectory, and copy machines are in there and everything like that. Then as we move down, we did have the possibility to do land acquisition out of the SAVE. We have not done that. We have $1.5 million budgeted this year, but we will not be doing that there for this year. Again, so that is an item that we haven't used. We've used some of the PEPL resources for the land acquisition, but it is there if we want to use it from the revenue purpose statement. And then it gets down to the piece that's probably has driven this conversation and why we're here tonight is how we use the community education. And that's the wording from the revenue purpose statement that's approved for community education. We use that as a match for the 21st century programs, as well as funding our SFAs, or student family advocates. Not to put an acronym out there, JP, that we haven't described, but that's what those are. And you can see that has went up the last couple years. That's mostly because we've put SFAs at every building now over the course of those years, as well as we've had to do some adjustments with their staffing for some of the responsibilities that those folks are taking on and how they're serving our students and our families. And so that's why you see a little bit of a jump there in those last couple years as we've made those adjustments. What we have done historically with the SAVE funds is allocated $600,000 for that community ed piece. You can see that we haven't spent that in most of those years. As we moved into the pandemic, some of those activities that were done with the 21st century programs couldn't occur because we couldn't go anywhere. Right. So we were limited with some of those enrichment activities. And so there was some pause there as to how some of those played out. And then if they don't use that $600,000 over time, they essentially can carry forward any of the fund balance that's there. So we have kept it available. And we've also utilized some of the ESSER resources to fund some of the 21st century match to extend that further, knowing that the actual federal grants that are funding some of that programming in general fund will be expiring over the next 3 years. So there's been some mindful and planful work going on there to use that $600,000 going forward. So that's kind of the autopsy, if you will, of the last 5 years and kind of the year that we're in. So.
Les, on the income portion,
Sure.
what happened to our interest income? It just from 170, that was a huge.
So if you look in 17 and 18, we would have had those bonds that we sold. We invest those, I'm investing
On
the
that.
sale of our bonds on Thursday, and we're going to get 5.5% interest rate on those bonds. In those 2 years there where the number's really low, we didn't have all of those bond funds because we'd spent them down, and so it was just the collection. But those interest rates were down at 0.1%.
Okay.
So it's just a factor of the interest rate.
I appreciate that.
So the 10,000 that's sitting there in 22, 23, not realistic. It's going to be a good
I
number.
guess. Yeah, it'll be
And the
better
next
than
couple
that.
years, it will be even better investing the bonds that we're selling this week.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Unless, I'm sorry, for the community education purposes, did you say we've been budgeting $600,000 a year for that? Or
Yes, that's what we've done.
Okay, and so we're actually, the last year, few years, we've used almost all of that?
We've
Is that
come
right?
pretty close, yes.
Okay.
Because some of those grants have started to fall off, so we've had to have additional match from
Okay.
SAVE to do that.
Okay, thanks.
Any additional questions? Well, I will close this presentation out with the question and a comment. So my question is it possible to have this document uploaded for us? Because we will want to go back to it, and some of us, like me, need to study it a little bit more than seeing it up there tonight. And to close it, do not throw anything at me, Les, but this is your last presentation with us tonight, and the last board meeting you'll be with us, so I am going to take the opportunity to thank you for your service to this district. For me personally, working with you for the last 6 years has been very informative because you put it in a language that I can always understand and appreciate. And I know you're not going too far, but I do hope that you enjoy your retirement and know that you'll be greatly missed by a lot of us up here. I think I speak for all the directors up here. So thank you again for your many years of service and for keeping the district in such good financial health over the years. I appreciate it. Thank you. Next up is our agenda setting. We have make sure I get this right, a closed session first on the 18th. That will start at 5:30. And then our regular meeting scheduled at 6 o'clock. We have some of the normal, this is the only meeting for July, so it may be a little bit lengthy because we have our annual operations report, our equity update. We're going to have a discussion item on legislative priorities, which I'm sure will be pretty in-depth as we try and figure out how do we prepare for the school year. And I know we have several parking lot items that we'll probably consider during our agenda setting meeting, but I just want to give an opportunity to see if there's new things directors have been thinking about or one or two items that you want to make sure we try and get on this agenda.
I do not want to add this to July's agenda, but, you know, the presentation tonight and just conversations I've been having, I think at some point it'd be helpful for us to, I don't know where this takes place, but we should have a discussion about AI in education and what that, it's here and whether that's going to be, you know, we just need to have a discussion about it, right? Some districts ban it. I certainly don't recommend that. But we're going to, you know, we need to talk about it. We should just be aware. I don't know who we have that knows anything about that, but I would start with Adam or other folks going down that rabbit hole. I know I've been going down that rabbit hole this summer, so.
Might have went down a rabbit hole this morning.
Yeah.
So,
Okay.
Yep.
So
We
that's
could-
one to
Yeah, we
have
can
on the radar.
definitely, I wrote that down.
Yeah. Yep, I got it in your board parking lot on the memo. And
Yeah.
I think like President Malone said, we do have a few items, but I've been kind of trying to structure them out there on the board parking lot so you can see. So most of the ones that she'd mentioned there, I was also hopeful that Trace will be here to kind of give you some updated information on Center for Innovation. And him and I are going to engage a couple times over the next couple weeks so I can kind of also articulate a plan to you about what this next 12 months would look like for some additional learning we want to do, how we start to pull some programming together, some ideas on that. So I think we have some good things for July that'll probably fill up most of our time in there. And I would just, the reason I spoke up is just to reference you back to that board update. And then if you have some other things, you can let us know too.
I will throw out there that we discussed at the last meeting the resolution about some of the bills that have come out of the legislature. And I checked with Superintendent Degner if that would be a way that we could proceed, and then Charlie volunteered me. And so I am willing to put a draft together, but my request is to the members is to send me either bullet points or whereas statements or be it resolved statement, but what you want to see in there, and I can compile all of that into a document that I would have. I won't be at this meeting, but my goal would be to have it ready at this meeting. And so if there's time, I don't think it would be an hour-long discussion. I think it would be a shorter discussion point. But if there's time, we could put it on that agenda, and then you all could discuss the draft and make edits and improvements, and then maybe by the time, with the goal of getting it out by the time school resumes in August. But I can work with that timeline if it works for all of you. So just email me what you want.
Thank you very much, Lisa Young.
Thank you for
And I'm-
volunteering.
And
me,
I'm
Charlie.
sorry I volunteered you.
Thank
But
you,
it was in
Charlie, for
recognition-
volunteering, Lisa.
It was in recognition of your great skills and abilities.
Was it?
Was there anything else? All right. Hearing nothing, I would entertain a motion to adjourn. I'm sorry, Superintendent Degner, I don't want to cut you off.
Sorry. No, there's one other thing we had in the parking lot I didn't say out loud was the FMP update. So
Yes.
we have kind of on an annual operations report. That's probably what we're all thinking, but that we'll probably have that be a standalone as well, just an actual item on the FMP. So
Yes.
you'll have a host of facility-related items on there.
That will be great.
Sorry
Thank you
about that.
so
Thank
much.
you.
No, you're fine. Okay. I would entertain a motion to adjourn.
I move that we adjourn.
There's-
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Thank you, everybody. Have a great